At this point, we've connected to our Cisco Catalyst switch via the console. We've assigned a management IP address, specified a default gateway. Now we want to set passwords for the console connection coming into the switch, as well as our VTY, our virtual terminal connections that are going to be coming into the switch when we're connecting via Telnet or Secure Shell. If we want to remind ourselves of the lines we have available, we can do a show line. Remember CTY, that's how we're connected right now, that's the console port, but I've got these 16 virtual terminal lines as well. Let's add a password to those lines, and let's say we want to be prompted for that password when we're connecting via one of those lines. To start off with, let's go into line, not interface, but line con 0 for console 0. And I'm going to say that my password is Cisco. You should probably use a more secure password in the real world, but to keep it easy to remember for you and for me in these video demonstrations, let's just use Cisco. And I then give the keyword of login to say I want to be prompted for that password. Notice my configuration mode right now. I'm in line configuration mode because I'm configuring a specific line. But I've got 16 of those VTY lines, and I can configure them all at once. If I just want to back out one configuration level, I want to go from config line back to config, back to global config, I could say exit. If I wanted to completely exit my configuration, I could say end. That would take me all the way out. I just want to back out one level though, so I'm going to say exit. And that takes me back to global configuration. Now I can say line VTY, and I don't have to do these lines one at a time. I can do them all at once. And the numbering starts at 0. I've got 16 VTY lines. Here's how we configure all of them at once. We say line VTY 0, because the numbering starts at 0, space 15. We're going to be configuring 16 lines when we enter these commands. Just like we did for the console line, let's set the password to Cisco, and let's say login. We're done, so I'm going to give not the exit command, but the end command to back all of the way out. We can see this configuration by looking at the running configuration. That's the configuration that's running in RAM right now. If I do a show run, which is short for show running configuration, and we scroll down toward the bottom, we're going to be able to see our config. Here we go. And don't be surprised if Cisco iOS breaks your 16 lines up into different chunks. This is a pretty common thing to see. This is not a problem for us, but we've got 5 lines here, and we've got 11 lines here. And here's our console line. Let's verify that this works by exiting all the way out of the switch and then coming back in and see if we're prompted for a password. Let's say exit. And it says press return to get started. I press return, and now it's asking for a password. It didn't do that before. We'll type in the password of Cisco, and we're brought back to user mode. And again, if I want to get back into privilege mode, we enter the keyword of enable. We've now configured line passwords for the console line and for our virtual terminal, our VTY lines. Now that we have our Cisco Catalyst switch configured with an IP address and a default gateway, and we've set up passwords, we're just about to connect remotely. And by remotely connecting, we're talking about connecting via Telnet or Secure Shell using a terminal emulation program such as PuTTY, or TerraTerm is another one that I've used for many years. Prior to doing any of that, though, let's make sure that we have connectivity over the network to this switch. We can use the ping command for that, P-I-N-G. That's a great command that we can use to check for basic connectivity, and we're going to be using that over and over in our networking careers. From a Microsoft Windows prompt, let's enter P-I-N-G followed by the IP address of our switch, the management IP address, 192.168.1.11. And we see that we're getting replies. We see the round trip time, 4 milliseconds, 1 millisecond, 2 milliseconds, 2 milliseconds. This is telling me that that switch is up and available. It is responding to pings. And by the way, a ping works using a protocol called ICMP. That's the Internet Control Message Protocol. It's a layer 3 protocol, and it sends out what is referred to as an ICMP echo. I'm sending a ping to this remote IP address, and I'm hoping to get an echo reply, a response from this IP address saying that yes, it is there. This was from a Microsoft Windows prompt. Let's do it again from a Macintosh OS X prompt, it's going to be the same command. We're still going to say ping and give the IP address of 192.168.1.11. One difference with Mac OS X, instead of just giving a few pings and stopping, it just continues until we break out of it. I'm going to do a Control-C to break out of the pings, but we see, sure enough, we do have connectivity. We're getting echo replies. We're getting ping responses from our switch. And in our next video, we're going to use Telnet to connect into the switch. One way of connecting to our Cisco Catalyst switch over the network is to use Telnet. And Telnet is considered non-secure because data is sent in plain text. If somebody had some sort of a packet capture utility like Wireshark and they captured our Telnet packets, well, the content of those Telnet packets, including our password, would be in clear text. They could read that. And therefore, we tend to prefer SSH, Secure Shell, as opposed to Telnet, because with SSH, the transmissions are going to be encrypted. But Telnet is still used quite a bit, and we need to be familiar with it. Before we try to connect remotely using Telnet, let's make sure that Telnet is allowed as an input transport on our VTY lines. We can check this out. Remember, we've got 16 VTY lines that we have configured, 0 through 15. Let's do a show line VTY 0 to get an idea of what transports are going to be allowed. And we're coming in to the switch, so we're concerned about input transports instead of output transports. That would apply to sessions initiated from the switch. We're coming into the switch, so we want to check out the input transports. And we've got a couple. Both Telnet and Secure Shell are enabled. If we wanted to change that, we could go in to line configuration mode for VTY 0 through 15. And from here, we can say transport input, and let's give some context-sensitive help by pressing a question mark. Pressing a question mark at this time tells me the commands that are available at this point. And we could say no protocols are going to be coming into the switch, none. All, which would include both Telnet and Secure Shell. That's what we have right now. Or if I just wanted to do one or the other, I could say transport input Telnet, and that would make Secure Shell unsupported. Or I could do transport input SSH, and that would make Telnet unsupported. For now, we'll just leave it at the default of transport input all, but at least that is how we check things out. Well, it looks like Telnet is enabled. We've already done a ping to confirm that we've got connectivity over the network to the switch. So now, let's fire up a terminal emulator and connect into this Cisco Catalyst switch. We could use a variety of terminal emulators. One is PuTTY. One is TerraTerm. Both are freely downloadable from the internet. Right now I'm in TerraTerm. Let's see how we can initiate a connection. Let's go under File and say New Connection. And here's the IP address of my Cisco Catalyst switch. And notice I can select my transport. Is it Secure Shell? Is it Telnet? In this video, we want to do Telnet. And I'll say OK. And look at that. It gives me a password prompt. We've already set up the password prompt previously. I'll just type in Cisco and press Enter, and we're now connected to the switch. Let's go into Enable mode, and I'm going to say Show Line, and we can see that we are connected via a VTY line. There's an asterisk next to that. And while we're here, let's take a look at how we can navigate around this environment just a little bit. If I were to type into commands such as Show IP Interface Brief, and I wanted to possibly edit that line, here's what I could do. As a shortcut, I could enter Control-A to jump my cursor to the beginning of the line. I could do a Control-E to go to the end of the line. If I wanted to delete the previous word in this command, I could do a Control-W. If I wanted to delete the entire current line, I could do a Control-X. Let me type this command in again. Let's do a Show IP Interface Brief. And I want to enter a couple of commands, actually. I want to have a command history. Cisco iOS can remember the commands we've typed in. Let's do a show run, and I'll just quit out of that. Let's do one more. Let's do a show memory. I just wanted to have a few commands in history to play with. What we can do is say Control-P, and that's going to pull up from history our prior command. Control-N is going to move us forward in our history. So think of P for previous and N for next. Control P, previous, Control N, next. Something else that will work on your keyboard, you can use the up and down arrows. I'm pressing the up arrow now to scroll through my history buffer, and now I'm pressing the down arrow to scroll back down. If we want to see everything in the history buffer, we can say show history, by the way, and by default we have our 20 previous commands stored in our history buffer. If we want to change that, we can go into line VTY 015 configuration mode and say history size, and we can have as many as 256 lines of history stored. I'm going to bump it up to, let's say, 100 lines of history that are going to be stored. And let me give you just a couple of other shortcut commands. What if we did my show IP interface brief command again, and let's move the cursor back to the I in interface. Check out what happens when I do a Control K. A Control K deletes from the cursor position through the rest of the line. Let me type the command back in, show IP interface brief, and let's move my cursor back to the I. I could do a Control U or a Control X. They do the same thing. Either of those commands would delete all of the characters to the left of the cursor. Let's just do a Control X, and it deletes everything to the left of the cursor. And I've put those commands up on screen for you right now as a reference. You might want to jot these down in your notes. This can come in really handy in the real world as you're navigating around Cisco iOS. And at this point, we've connected using TerraTerm, but another common terminal emulator is PuTTY. Let's take a quick look at PuTTY. Let's get PuTTY launched, and I'm saying Telnet as my connection type. Here's the IP address of my switch. Let's say open, and let's get logged in. If I do a show line, we see that I'm now connected to a couple of VTY lines. This is my connection via PuTTY. This is my connection via TerraTerm. This is my connection via the console. Again, TerraTerm and PuTTY, a couple of freely available terminal emulators out on the internet. Or you might be using something like Mac OS X. Let's bring up a Mac OS X terminal window, and from here we could simply say Telnet 192.168.1.11, and let's enter the password. And I'm connected using the terminal that's built into Mac OS X. And again, in summary, Telnet is commonly used for a remote connection into our device. However, Cisco recommends that we use Secure Shell, SSH, because Secure Shell is going to encrypt the data that we're transmitting and receiving to and from the device, as opposed to Telnet, which sends and receives in clear text. Right now we're connected to our Cisco Catalyst switch via a Telnet session. You notice I'm using PuTTY for that Telnet session. And while Telnet is great, it's not secure. If I type in a command in this switch, if I say show run to look at the running configuration, for example, that information just got sent over the network in clear text. And if somebody had a packet sniffer, they could capture the data. If I were to enter a password, if I were to change the password in this switch, somebody could see that via Telnet. So Cisco recommends that we use Secure Shell, SSH, instead of Telnet. We've got a bit of work to do, though, to get it set up. First of all, we need to configure a username, because when we log in via Secure Shell, we're not just going to give a password like we did with Telnet. We're going to give a username and a corresponding password. Now, this username and password combination, it could live on an external authentication server. We're just going to keep it simple, though. We're going to create a local username database, and we can do that with the username command. I'll say username, and I'll create a username of Cisco, and I'll say it has a password of Cisco. Not a great password for the real world, but it keeps it simple for our demonstration. Now that we've got that configured, Cisco says that we should assign this switch a domain name. Now, this does not mean that we have to go into our DNS server and actually make an entry for this switch. We just need to say that there's a domain name associated with this switch. And we can say IP domain -name, and we could just use something like cisco.com or maybe yourcompany.com. But let's enter some domain name for use in the switch's construction of a digital certificate. You see, the switch needs to create its own and sign its own digital certificate. A digital certificate is what you use when you purchase something on the internet. You go to a website, enter your credit card information. Hopefully that website is using HTTPS, the secure version of HTTP. And that site is going to send you their digital certificate. And inside of that digital certificate, there is a public key. And when you encrypt your credit card information with their public key, the only key that can decrypt that encryption is the corresponding private key. And that server you're communicating with, they never give out their private key. And therefore, if it is intercepted by someone, they're not going to be able to decrypt what you just encrypted. It can only be decrypted by the intended recipient. We need such a digital certificate for our switch. Now, this digital certificate does not have to be purchased. We can have what is referred to as a self-signed certificate. We can say it's okay to just sign the certificate yourself. Here's how we create that certificate. We say crypto key generate RSA. And we're asked, how many bits do we want the modulus to be? The more bits, the more secure. 512 is going to be fine for our purposes. And now we can set the SSH version. I'm going to say IP SSH version 2 as opposed to version 1. Now let's go into our line configuration mode for our VTY lines. That's how we're going to be connecting via SSH. Let's say line VTY, and I'll give the range of VTY lines. It was 0 through 15. And we've already seen that the input transport is set for SSH. If it were not, we could say transport input, and context-sensitive help shows that we could say just SSH to only support SSH. Right now it's set to all. That's the default, meaning that we can communicate via Telnet or Secure Shell. I'll just leave it at the default. But something we do need to do here, we need to tell the VTY lines where to find the user database. We're going to be giving a username and a password combination. Where does that user database live? Well, in our case, it lives locally. So we're going to say login local. I think we're done with our configuration. So let's open up another terminal window and connect via SSH. I'm using PuTTY right now, and I could certainly use PuTTY to connect via SSH. But since we mentioned TerraTerm earlier, let's see how to connect via TerraTerm. Let's go under File, New Connection. I'm going to use SSH version 2. By the way, that's using TCP port 22. There's the IP address of my switch, the management IP address. We say OK, and it says, what is the username and passphrase? Meaning that it's asking for the username and password. We'll say Cisco, click OK, and we get our switch prompt. We are now connected via Secure Shell.